Hello everyone, I'm MaskofGames, and we're going to do a little bit of a discussion and a review of Fatal Frame 3. We just got finished with our playthrough of the game, and I have a lot to talk about, so we're going to just dive into it. Whenever we complete a game, I talk about the game from a mechanical standpoint, from a story standpoint, and an overall standpoint. And then we talk about whether I recommend it, not recommend it, whether I have caveats or not. A lot of cases, I have caveats. So, Fatal Frame 3, mechanically speaking, is probably... I feel like it has a lot more going on, because you play three separate characters. And I think that's both a pro and a con, really. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But I still feel like 2 just felt like a more streamlined experience. And it kind of shows in how some of that's handled in 3. I don't think it's handled poorly with the combat in 3. It's just they bring back some cheap tricks, essentially, from Fatal Frame 1 to make things difficult. But it makes them, for me, just feel unfair and not necessarily difficult because I need to, like, raise my skill or get better, right? It just feels like they're just unfair advantages to the things you're fighting, which makes it, you know, which obviously would make it harder, but just not as fun to do. But mechanically speaking, you play 3 separate characters. They all use the camera obscura. It has level ups. It has different lenses and stuff like that. My problem arises is each person's camera obscura. So you have Rei, you have Kei, and you have Miku. And each one of their cameras level up separately. However, Rei's camera does not carry over to anybody else's camera, and same thing with each character. Kei's camera, however, does not level up properly. So I showed in our last little bit, if you go watch the last few videos, when we put a point into Kei's more damage, it does not actually add more damage. You only get 2 sigils to fight with Kei's camera, and he is required to fight. At first, he has an ability, and everybody has abilities. We'll talk about those in just a second. But he has an ability that doesn't help him in fights. In fact, it helps him avoid fights. However, there are multiple instances in his segments where he's forced to fight. And he has the weakest camera, and it cannot get any stronger. It is miserable to deal with, to say the least. Kei's segments, from a mechanical standpoint, are by far my least favorite to engage with, because he just doesn't have a way to deal with combat, and being forced into combat without a way to deal with combat, it feels like basically throwing the character in a hole and just letting them drown. Like, it's just, it doesn't feel good to play. So each character has a special mechanic, and Kei's mechanic is that he can hide. I don't know why they decided that was his mechanic, but that's his mechanic. He hides, which is great for certain segments. You get little stealth segments where you have to hide behind something so a ghost will walk past you. That's fine. Usually before you get the camera obscura, or if it's a ghost that you can't actually fight, like the Tattooed Priestess, which we'll talk about a lot of the characters in the story. But so it works in a couple segments, but once you get to the end of the game, there's required fights. And one of those fights really shows how bad having this character who can't get a strengthened camera fight does. And basically, this ghost will fly around. It can fly up above you, which is really tedious to deal with. If it gets above you, it can just 180 and grab you. We have multiple instances of that in the videos. And on top of that, when he does get the shot, like when it flies in front of him, he does get the shot. He does the least amount of damage, regardless of like what film he's using, basically. So he has the weakest camera. The film only gives him so much, and you don't get a lot of powerful film with him, to be honest. So it is it is an absolute nightmare from a mechanical standpoint to play Kay. We'll talk about why he's in the game in the first place, but other mechanics that are added. Ray, which is the main character, gets a flash, which allows you to basically, in most cases, knock back a ghost, either after they've grabbed you, or if they're coming at you and you flash them, they'll get stunned for a second. Sometimes this will open up a shutter chance or a fatal frame chance, depending on the ghost and stuff like that. So you can use it either offensively or defensively. I used it more defensively, but yeah, the camera lenses come back. They can be upgraded. You have Blast, you have Zero, you've got a new one, I think, which is called Pierce, which is where you basically have amount of time where your film does more damage. So it's very good against like bosses or very tanky enemies, which is cool to see that they thought about that. And Miku's ability is she gets slow time whenever she wants. So she basically gets the slow lens as long as she has stuff in her meter. Now the problem is with her meter, it goes down, and as far as I could tell, the only way to get it to go up is by being attacked. And she is the weakest character from a health standpoint, to where one grab basically does half her health, which is very Fatal Frame 1, which is where the character is from. By the way, yes, it is the same Miku from Fatal Frame 1. Again, we'll talk about that with the story and stuff. But yeah, so she is exceptionally weak. But her camera can be upgraded, so she can simplify some of the fights just by powering up, which again is something that Kay cannot do. And then Ray plays basically like your normal protagonist with the upgraded camera, upgraded lenses, all of that stuff. And it's basically a very mechanically Fatal Frame game for her. But having the separate characters with separate leveling, and another thing that makes it a little bit worse is they share points. So if one person kills like 10 ghosts, all of them have to share those points for upgrades. But all of them have separate cameras, so those upgrades do not carry over. And it's the same thing with lenses. If one character has a lens, the other characters don't have that lens. So there's a lot of separation between the characters from a mechanical standpoint that I think really drags down the mechanics. And again, I really, really did not enjoy playing Kay's segments, which is the guy who's a friend of the main character's boyfriend. Trying to think if there's any other mechanical things. A lot of the stuff still makes a return. You still have your combos from 2. You still have your shutter chances, obviously. Most of the camera mechanics are the same. They did change the way you power up your camera back to Fatal Frame 1's kind of thing. So if you remember our Fatal Frame 2 playthrough, which if you haven't seen, it's down below in the videos. There is a playlist, so go ahead and watch that. But in Fatal Frame 2, it basically automatically just fills up depending on distance and whether they're in a shutter chance. Whereas in Fatal Frame 1, it had to go do, like it had to fill up. Well, that comes back in Fatal Frame 3, except it's around the camera. So it goes do. And that fills up, and that's how you do more powerful shots. So they brought some mechanics back from 1, brought some mechanics from 2, and kind of put them all together. Overall, it wasn't a terrible experience. I just feel like some of the fights were harder than they needed to be, because they didn't really give you a way to use your mechanics to deal with them, or they took advantage of knowing how the mechanics work to abuse the player ability, essentially. It's like, oh, well, you can't aim directly up, so something's above you, that kind of thing. They did bring back the being in walls and teleporting around you kind of stuff. They don't do as much teleporting as they did in the first game, but they do quite a bit. But it's easier to kind of manage, because a lot of times they give you a lot of wind up. Like there's one boss or one ghost that when she teleports, sometimes she just cries for a bit. So you'll be like facing her over here, she'll teleport over here, and then you have to you could turn your camera and she cries and then stands up. So you have plenty of time to move your camera over to her. So it doesn't feel like the first game where it was like, ghost, beside you, grab. Ghost beside you, grab. Right? Like, there's not as much of that. Although the flying ghosts at the end, where they can fly above you and then like 180 and grab you, it's a little too much. But that's kind of it from a mechanical standpoint. Again, if you play Fatal Frame, you kind of know what to expect from the mechanics, except they've made a few adjustments here and there. Now, story-wise, this story might be my favorite Fatal Frame story so far. Now, I have not played 4 and 5. We have the intention to play those soon, but I have not played 4 and 5. But out of 1, 2, and 3, this is my favorite because they don't just focus on traditional ritualistic, harm, essentially. It's not just about religious kind of abuse. There's actually a story that connects people to this ritual, connects our 3 characters to the ritual. Again, the characters are Rei, which is new to this game. We have Miku, who is the main character from Fatal Frame 1. And then we have Rei, K, sorry, not to be confused with Rei. They're spelled basically the same, except one starts with a K, the other one starts with an R. Not confusing at all. But anyways, K is the uncle of the characters from Fatal Frame 2. So that's how he's kind of connected to the story. So Fatal Frame 3 ties all of the stories together through this Manor of Sleep, is what it's called. It's a mansion that people go to when they sleep, and basically it allows them to contact loved ones, but in essence, if they stay there too long, it kills them. It takes them to the other side. There is a tattooed priestess who is basically the catalyst for this happening. Basically, they usually do a ritual to stop people from being able to venture into the place where that would take them to the other side. But because of some mishaps, the tattoo priestess basically is able to break free and break that bond, which forces a rift to essentially open up and let people sleep until they die, essentially, is what it is. But the reason why I like this story is because the story that's told adjacent to the story of the ritual is a story about guilt, specifically survivor's guilt. And this is the first Fatal Frame, at least in my opinion, where they've actually talked about some sort of mental health issue on top of the ritualistic or religious kind of abuse and traditionalism and kind of stuff like that, right? And it does it in a very, very good way, because it does it through physical manifestation as well as just plain storytelling. And it also, this game has probably the happiest ending of the first 3, which is very cool. Because the first 2, like, those endings, they're the canon endings, but they just feel like bad endings. There are good endings for those games, but apparently they're not canon according to this game. So, do with that what you will. But basically, it's a story about survivor's guilt and grief, and basically that weighing on people. I say basically a little too much, probably. And that weight is shown as a tattoo on the skin of our main character. It's a tattoo that starts on her back and slowly grows down like her arm and her body to show that she's being overcome by grief, but it's showing it visually as well as telling us about it. So she is searching this Manor of Sleep for her boyfriend who died in a car wreck, which she survived. His name is Yu, which is, of course, very confusing and also leads to a lot of jokes about, hey, where do you find you? That kind of thing. But it's Y-U-U. So she's got some survivor's guilt about, oh no, he died in a crash. I should have died with him, or it should have been me. If you know anything about survivor's guilt, it's essentially what kind of happens mentally is there's some sort of accident or some sort of loss of someone you care for, and you tend to blame yourself for that loss. like, oh, that person shouldn't have died, I should have died, or that person shouldn't have died, you know, I would give anything to bring them back. There's a lot of like survivor's guilt, different aspects of survivor's guilt depending on like the situation and stuff. But that is the main focus of the story, adjacent to the story of the ritual that is about dealing with guilt. So it feeds back into that narrative, and they mesh very, very well from a story standpoint. I won't go into any spoilers about it, but it does kind of tie up a little bow about how you handle that guilt, and it does it in a very, very pleasing way, because it's very hard to just tell people to not think about it or get better. Well, actually, it's very easy to tell people to do that, and people think that like, oh, that'll solve your problem, just don't think about it, right? Like, obviously that doesn't work. If that worked, then a lot less people would be having mental health issues that they have. But the game doesn't approach it from that aspect. It approaches it from a very healthy aspect, which is the idea of the reason why, one, that guilt will always be with you. And that's referenced directly in the game. It talks about how that guilt is always with the people that give their guilt to the priestess. She can feel that guilt. She can see that guilt. She can see the situations that cause that guilt. And she knows that, like, even though they've given that guilt to her, that pain to her, they still will always feel that. And I think that's a really good message, which leads into the message at the end, which is the reason to survive is so you can live on with the memory of the person you lost, right? Because if you're gone, there might not be anybody left to remember them. So the best way to honor their memory is to stick around and talk about them. Share those happy memories, share in their passions and stuff, the things you did together, because you're keeping them essentially alive, at least their memory alive, by continuing to go forward. And that's the message you get at the end. And you actually see in the ending cutscene her grief get passed on to someone, which again, that's kind of the idea of kind of healing, is realizing that grief, that survivor's guilt, is not because of a decision you made. It's just because of a situation that happened. You don't have to be guilty for surviving. It's just sometimes that's just what happens, and you have to live with the fact that that's what happened, and it wasn't your fault, right? Or it wasn't necessarily your fault. And I think that's a really good message. And I'm glad that they finally told a story that had something other than ritualistic murder as like the big thing. That's still in here, but all of that feeds directly back into the narrative of guilt and depression and all of that stuff. And it's so well done. I could probably talk about the story of this game for hours, but I'm going to leave it at, I think this is probably my favorite story of the Fatal Frame series thus far. I've not played 4 and 5, so we'll see how they hold up story-wise, but this one was fantastic from a story standpoint. So, let's do a little bit of an overview. Mechanically, a little disappointed in the characters. I think having 2 weaker characters really drags down the gameplay. Story-wise, it's my favorite. So now I'm on kind of a fence of recommendation, right? Part of me says I don't know if I would recommend this game because there's a lot of unfairness on a mechanical standpoint that can make it very hard for people to get through this. Now, we did play it on normal, and there is an easy mode. I am only referencing playing this on normal, so maybe easy would make this better for other people, but based on the experience that I had, I can see a lot of people struggling with very specific fights for very specific reasons, and a lot of those reasons have to do with the developers basically being like, how can we make this fight unfair, and it shows with those fights just how unfair or unbalanced those fights are. And I'm not the best Fatal Frame player. I'll go ahead and say that up front. I know there's people that are like loads better than me and played hundreds or thousands of hours of it, whatever it may be, but I will say that, like, getting through certain parts of this game just was very hard for me. There are a couple moments, mostly with K specifically, but there's a couple with K, or there's mostly K and a couple I think with Miku, where it just like it really like just brought down the experience. Like no matter how the good the story was, playing it was really hard to get through at points, and it like I'm just so on the fence about how I feel about it, because I think this is, again, I think this is the best story thus far of the original trilogy of Fatal Frame. I think the story is worth experiencing, but on the other hand, the mechanics really could keep people from actually experiencing the game. And I would say I will give this a... This might be the first time I say maybe. I'll be honest. This might be the first time I give you a maybe recommendation. Usually I give you a yes or a no, but because of the mechanics, I don't think I can fully endorse the game, because I can see people struggling with some of these fights, so much so they may not be able to finish it. But on the other hand, I think there's some people that will power through, like myself, because they want to experience that story. They want to learn about the story, and it's an amazing story. So I guess my recommendation is this. If you like Fatal Frame and you're willing to deal with some very harsh mechanics, I can recommend it to you. If you've not played Fatal Frame and you don't want to deal with the harsh mechanics, I probably wouldn't recommend it to you, because it is difficult at certain points. I still think it's easier than the first game, which I believe I didn't recommend the first game. I think I would still recommend this one over the first game, but this one is still very hard to recommend from a mechanical standpoint, because some of those fights are rough. So again, if you're a Fatal Frame fan and you think you can manage with some hard fights, definitely recommend, definitely worth a play. If you're not a Fatal Frame fan, if this is going to be your first Fatal Frame game, beware, because some of this stuff will be rough, but I don't know if I'd recommend it to you. I think you'd rather I think you could experience this story from just watching a playthrough. I don't think you really, there's not a lot of mechanics that lead directly into dealing with the story. It's mostly just Fatal Frame with the stories on top of it, obviously. So I will say this is probably the first time I'm going to say maybe. So basically, I would recommend it to some people, wouldn't recommend it to others. I would say if you want to know if it's something you're interested in, watch our playthrough or watch someone else's playthrough, kind of get a feel for what they're looking at, and then see if it's something you're willing to deal with. If it is, good luck to you. I hope you enjoy the experience. If it's not, I would say just watch the story or read about the story or whatever it is, because it is a story worth talking about. It is a story worth looking at. So, but anyways, that's gonna be my recommendation. Is just a hard maybe, which I know is a weird thing for me to say, but there's games where it's very obvious that people can't get through it, and there's games where it's very obvious people can get through it. And I think this is one of those games where it's not obvious either way, because some of it might have just been how we played, and some of it might be just how the game is designed. Again, we played on normal. There is easy, so maybe that will just simplify everything, and you can just two-shot all the ghosts and experience your way through the game. If that's the case, definitely would recommend it. But I can't speak to easy. It's definitely something you would have to try. I will say this game is kind of expensive. Let me get you that price. Okay, Fatal Frame 3, The Tormented on PS2. Oh, the price has actually come down a bit, but it's still $95 to $100. So it might be a little pricey for you. We did play a PS2 copy. I got it a while back, but so I would say probably emulate it. I don't know if there are any updated ports or anything of this, but If there's not, probably emulate it because it's a little pricey, especially if you don't have a PS2 and stuff. Definitely emulate it. But there you go. That's kind of where I am with the review. So thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry I can't give you a more definitive yes or no, but it's just hard with this one. It's very hard with this one. But check it out. Check our playthrough out. Check other people's playthrough out. And while you're here, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. All of that really does help push this channel out to more people like yourself that love retro games like us, especially retro horror games. So if you want to help us out, that is the best way to do it. And I do read all the comments, so if you want to leave a comment being like, hey, this is what I thought, or hey, maybe this would have made it easier, or whatever, leave all those comments. I love seeing those comments. If there's moments in the game or the playthrough that you love, leave those comments as well. And if I make any compilations, I'll give you some credits in those compilations for finding all the cool stuff that we've done. But that'll be it for this review. Thank you so much for being here. I do appreciate you. And as always, I will see you in the next review. Have a good one.